Before we begin, I wish to point out that what I wish to stress in the piece I'm about to read are two important points. The first point is that this event, which took place in Listowel barracks in June 1920, was a game changer. It was one of the most crucial events in the course of the War of Independence. And the second point is that the mutiny of the constables didn't come out from left field, from nowhere. Already for a number of years there was disillusionment and discontent and mutiny bubbling inside the ranks of the Royal Irish Constabulary. So these are the 2 points that I wish to stress in this particular piece, which I'm now about to read. At the outset, I wish to thank ex-Minister Jimmy Deenan and the committee for the privilege of participating in this well-deserved commemoration of the remarkable courage and patriotism of the 15 members of the Royal Irish Constabulary who were involved in the historic event which occurred in the Listowel Police Barracks a century ago. It is wonderful to see that so many of the proud relatives of these men are participating in this commemoration. The crucial events, influence, and the importance of this event is now generally agreed by historians. The mutiny of these 15 members of the RIC in the police barracks in Listowel in June 1920 was one of the most significant events in Ireland's War of Independence. 15 constables refused to be transferred and to hand their barracks over to the military. As news of this spread throughout the RIC and appeared later in the press, the pace of members of the force taking early retirement are being dismissed, quickened. Eventually, by 1 March 1921, 2,570 members had left the force. Their places were taken by the hastily recruited Black and Tans. For the most part, these were ex-soldiers, and they received little, if any, serious police training. Their indiscipline and the outrages for which they were responsible alienated the Irish people, most of whom had no enthusiasm whatsoever for the policy and actions of Sinn Féin and the IRA. The result was that the Crown forces found themselves operating in an increasingly hostile environment, which cast serious doubts on their capacity to successfully pacify the country. To understand and to appreciate this event, it is necessary to place oneself in the context of those who were involved in it. The Rising in 1916, and particularly the executions in its immediate aftermath, had a considerable effect on some members of the RIC. They foresaw the dilemma in which, as members of paramilitary force, they would be placed in the event of a serious conflict between Irish separatists and the Crown forces. Coincidentally, in 1917-1918, in spite of government opposition, some of the British police had succeeded in reorganising the National Union of Police and Prison Officers, which had been founded earlier in 1913. With the support of representatives of the RIC and the Dublin Metropolitan Police, Sergeant Thomas J. McKellig at RIC established an Irish branch of the National Union of Police and Prison Officers in 1918. According to a report in the Irish Independent of the 8th of February 1919, and I quote, "Practically all the DMP had joined the Union, including the Harbour Police. The majority of prison officials were also members, and so far 3,500 members of the RIC." End of quote. In the event, while the National Union of Police and Prison Officers was recognised by the authorities in London, McKelligot and his colleagues were informed that they were not to join the Union, as they belonged to a semi-military force under the direct control of the Crown, and subject in many respects to the discipline and the general conditions of employment of the Army and the Navy. Notwithstanding this rejection, the Irish Police Union, that's the Irish branch of the Union, held its first All-Ireland Conference in April 1919, at which one of the resolutions carried was that the force be disarmed. In the meantime, in the struggle between the Crown forces and those of Sinn Féin, more and more members of the RIC were becoming victims of the IRA's murderous campaign against the force. On the fateful day, 19th of June 1920, Colonel George Ferguson Smith, the Divisional Commissioner of the Combined Crown Forces, Military and Police of the province of Munster, left the constables in the barracks in Listowel in no doubt that they were to be in the very forefront of an all-out war on the forces of Sinn Féin. His bellicose and highly emotional address simply occasioned a mutiny which was bubbling beneath the surface.
1920 was a terribly bad year for the RIC. 556 of their members resigned, 746 took their pension and got out. And no doubt about it, I'd say lots of fellas resigned as a result of what had taken place in this zone.
Patrick was born in Strayed in Foxford on the 16th of March, 1892. His family were huge supporters of Michael Davitt and the Land League in Strayed, something which had a significant influence on Patrick as he was growing up. He joined the RIC on the 16th of March 1912 at the age of 20 years. After 6 months training in Phoenix Park, he was stationed in Glenbeigh from 1912 to 1914, in Cologlin from 1914 to 1917, and in Listowel from 1917 to 1920. Married Margaret Morrissey in April 1920. By the time of the mutiny, he had been serving the Listowel barracks for in excess of 2 years. He was a tall, strapping man at well over 6 foot. He was a very forthright and conscientious man, a man of integrity and highly regarded as being too principled for his own good. He had most to lose by taking part in this mutiny, as he was living in Brusnakerry, only 15 miles away, with a new wife. To just discuss the details of the mutiny, on the 17th of June 1920, the police in Listowel received orders from headquarters to hand over the barracks to the British military. All but one constable were to be transferred to the outlying huts or stations in the district, where they were now to act as scouts for the troops, which was a very dangerous new development. The constables in the Listowel barracks held a meeting. It was agreed that Constable Mee would be their spokesman, and they agreed that they would not obey these orders, and they communicated this to their superiors. Either later on the 17th of June or on the 18th, the next day, the county inspector, Poor O'Shea, came to Listowel to force the constable's hand. Mee refused to obey the order of the divisional commander. O'Shea told him to resign. He offered his resignation along with 13 other constables. Later on the 18th of June, District Inspector Thomas Flanagan, in a private meeting with the constables, advised them to all stick together. A message was received from headquarters in Tralee that all constables were to be present themselves on parade on the following morning at 10 o'clock. Closer to 10:30, 4 Crossley tenders drove up with a variety of dignitaries, from high-ranking police officers and decorated senior military officers, to include Colonel Smith and General Tudor, who was the police advisor to the Viceroy of Ireland. In addition, there were 15 armed, helmeted policemen and soldiers, a force of 50 strong. Colonel Smythe, the new Divisional Commissioner for the Military and Police of Munster, addressed the men. He made no reference for the refusal to follow orders and said that he had been appointed by the Prime Minister. He was to relay instructions, commands and details of the new postings, orders and strategies, to include new night raids accompanied by military and ambushes 5 or 6 nights a week, to arrest civilians, and at any sign of resistance they were to shoot first and ask questions later. There was to be no prosecutions for such behaviour and no inquests into any such activity. Constable Mee, as the spokesman, stepped forward and pointedly stated that they were not going to cooperate, and he returned his English cap, belt and bayonet, which he placed on a table. Smith ordered me to subsequently be arrested and led out, quickly followed by his supporters, who scuffled with the arresting team and surrounded me as they entered an adjacent room. A conciliatory General Tudor then met with the constables, who he tried to appease. The remaining military, having found that the telephone lines were cut, now also felt exposed and threatened, and they subsequently left the barracks. Mee quickly recorded a contemporaneous note detailing precisely what Colonel Smith had said in his address to the men, something Smith was to try and deny later.
Well, men, I have something of interest to tell you. Something that I am sure you would not wish your wives to hear. I am going to lay all my cards on the table, but I must reserve one card for myself. Now, men, Sinn Féin have had all the sport up to this. We are going to have the sport now. The police have done splendid work, considering the odds against them. They are not sufficiently strong to do anything but hold their barracks. This is not enough. For as long as we remain on the defensive, so long Sinn Féin will have the whip hand. We must take the offensive and beat Sinn Féin with their own tactics. Martial law applying to all Ireland is coming into operation shortly, and our scheme of amalgamation must be complete by the 21st of June. I am promised as many troops as I require from England. Thousands are coming daily. I am getting 7,000 police from England. Now, men, what I wish to explain to you is that you are to strengthen your comrades in the outstations. The military are to take possession of the large centres where they will have control of the railways and lines of communication and be able to move rapidly from place to place. Unlike police, who can act as individuals and on their own initiative, military must act in large numbers and under a good officer. He must be a good officer, or I shall have him removed. If a police barracks is burned, or if the barracks already occupied is not suitable, then the best house in the locality is to be commandeered and the occupants thrown out in the gutter. Let them die there. The more the merrier. You must go out at least 6 nights a week and get out of the barracks by the back door or skylight, so that you will not be seen. Police patrols in uniform will go out at the front door as a decoy. The military and police will patrol the country roads at least 5 nights a week. They are not to confine themselves to the main roads, but to go across the country, lie in ambush, take cover behind fences, near the roads, and when civilians are seen approaching, shout, "Hands up!" Should the order be not obeyed immediately, shoot, and shoot with effect. If the persons approaching carry their hands in their pockets or are in any way suspicious looking, shoot them down. You may make mistakes occasionally, and innocent persons may be shot, but this cannot be helped, and you are bound to get the right persons sometimes. The more you shoot, the better I will like you, and I assure you that no policeman will get into trouble for shooting any man. In the past, policemen have got into trouble for giving evidence at coroner's inquests. As a matter of fact, coroner's inquests are to be made illegal, so that in future no policeman will be asked to give evidence at inquests. Hunger strikers will be allowed to die in jail. The more, the merrier. Some of them have died already, and a damn bad job they were not all allowed to die. As a matter of fact, some of them have been dealt with in a manner that their friends will never hear about. A ship will be leaving an Irish port in the near future with lots of Sinn Féiners on board. I assure you, men, it will never land. That now is all I have to say to you. We want your assistance in carrying out this scheme in wiping out Sinn Féin. Any man who is not prepared to cooperate is a hindrance rather than a help, and he had better leave the force at once.
Smith pointed his finger at me. I stepped forward and said, "By your accent, I take it you are an Englishman. You seem to forget that you are addressing Irishmen." Taking off my cap, I laid it on the table in front of Colonel Smith and said, "This is English. You may have it as a present from me." Having done this, I completely lost my temper, and taking off my belt and bayonet, clapped them down on the table, saying, "These too are English. You may have them, and to hell with you, you murderer."
Some of the constables present signed the back of the note, which was later handed to Father Charles O'Sullivan, who was responsible for sending it up to Dublin as quick as possible. After the military left the barracks, and over the next subsequent 2 to 3 weeks, there was no official communication from the authorities. On the 6th of July 1920, it was decided by 5 key people that no purpose would be gained by staying on in the barracks, and they would leave their posts the following day. This was Constables me, Donovan, Fitzgerald, Hughes and Shearer. The Divisional Inspector Flanagan was informed, and Father Charles O'Sullivan gave each man a character reference and as a letter of testimony. The next day, on the 7th of July, the 5 men left the barracks. All but Sheeran travelled together from Listowel to Limerick by train, where they took a car and then drove to Galway.
John Donovan was born in Bresca, Clarina, County Limerick in 1891, and in September 1913 he joined the RIC. He served in a number of counties before being posted to Listowel, County Kerry in 1919. In June 1920, John Donovan was one of 5 RIC members who refused to obey the orders of their commanding officer at Listowel Police Station. Police Commissioner Colonel Smith had suggested, while negotiating with the constables, that they would be given the power to shoot any suspect on sight. The men refused for reasons of personal safety and in sympathy with their own countrymen fighting against the British forces. The former policemen knew their lives were in danger after their perceived mutiny. They decided to go to Galway, the home of county of Jeremiah Mee. They travelled by train to Limerick and from there to Tuam by car. The men split up, and John Donovan and Jeremiah Mee travelled to Mee's home in Glenamady, County Galway. When the police and military discovered their whereabouts, they were forced to move again. This time they travelled to Kesh, County Sligo, where both Donovan and me had served as policemen. The two men then travelled to Dublin to be interviewed by Erskine Childers, Michael Collins and Countess Markovich. By now the Listowel Mutiny was international news and had been raised in Westminster. Less than 3 weeks after John Donovan had met Countess Markovich, she had arranged employment for him at the Court Laundry in Harcourt Street, Dublin. Initially he was forced to use an unassumed name, but he went on to serve as foreman manager at the laundry for the next 40 years. He retired in 1960 and died 4 years later.
Lachlan was born in Lusma in County Offaly. He was from a large family, one of 9 boys and 2 girls. His father was dead by the time he was 9 years of age, and his mother by the time he was 18. In 1908, this photograph was taken of the family. The occasion of the photograph was the return of their Uncle Dan from Australia. He was to go back to Australia with one of the other boys, and he chose to take Ned with him. My grandmother told me that all of the suits in the photograph were borrowed from the neighbouring villages. They found it very difficult to survive. Lachlan is here in the back row. My grandmother is with the headband in the front. On October 15th, 1913, Lachlan joined the RIC. He was stationed at Listowel barracks. After the mutiny, his record would state that he was moved to Cavan. However, the family say that he never went there. He was officially dismissed in November 1920. So how did the Listowel mutiny affect the rest of his life? Well, the decisions that they made over those days had a profound effect. He moved first of all to Liverpool, where he would have met with my grandmother. But he felt that the authorities were after him there and he was in danger. So he moved on to Australia. He arrived in Fremantle in 1922. On arrival, he immediately went into the Australian bush. He lived there in isolation, living off rabbits that he was able to trap himself. But after 3 years, he was suffering from starvation and had to emerge. He caused quite the stir when he appeared because of his appearance, and he was on the front of the Adelaide Mail for a number of weeks and became known as the Hermit of the Hills. They said about him at the time, from a distance, his tall, gaunt figure, limping, bewhiskered face, tight, ill-fitting garments and long hair gave the appearance of extreme age. He had a look of startled fear. He was hospitalised for 6 months in a hostel for homeless men run by a Reverend Smith. They said he had a lot of cash on him when he arrived, which they returned to him when he had recovered. During that time, he wrote one letter home to my grandmother. She was now living in Cork. He says to her at the end of the letter, "I don't like this country. I don't like to be alone in this world. This is a very wild country. You might see me in Cork City, like when I get tired roving around the world. I may return when old age catches me." This was his only letter home, and he signed it just with his initials, LD. His brother Ned, who moved to Australia in 1908 with Uncle Dan, had tried to find him a number of times. He even put a column in the Friends Reunited section of a national newspaper and ran it for 12 months, but there was no contact. He thought he'd caught up with him at one stage, but when he got to the dwelling house, there was just a suitcase under the bed with a few bits and scraps that clearly belonged to Lachlan. Interestingly, when Ned wrote to my mother in 1952, he said that a Secret Service agent had arrived at his house in the 30s looking for Lachlan. He was from Canada House in London. As a child, I was always fascinated by the stories that my grandmother and mother would tell me. So in the last year, I decided to do my own search on the internet. I found a number of entries for him in a number of towns and bush villages. In 1943, he was arrested for vagrancy and he was imprisoned for 15 days just for not having the means to support himself. He also appears in Tyringham and Dorrigo. I decided that I would contact the village of Dorrigo. It's a community of 300 people, mainly farming families, who have lived there for a number of years. Probably over 100 years, the one family would stay in the farming area. So I chanced it, and to my amazement, a number of people in their 80s contacted me. They said they remembered him, but they remembered him as Paddy Dolan because of his distinct Irish brogue. He lived in a disused building which was called the Old Slaughterhouse. It was across the road from the Anshow Bakery where he used to warm himself. He kept himself very well. He would wash down by the Danger Falls. He was tall, polite, kept himself to himself, and was known to walk great distances. And in his younger days, he was known as the best spud picker around. He is more than likely buried in an unmarked grave that was kept by the council for people who had no means to bury themselves. It is great to think that 100 years on, he's been remembered.
The memories I have of my father are that he was a very tall, good-looking man, very kind, considerate, and the neighbours all loved him. He was a really, really, really nice man. When I found out about the mutiny in Listowel, would have been one time that I was down on holidays in County Limerick in Kilfinnan, my mother's hometown, and we were out in the meadow, as we all helped then, and my uncle said, we stopped on a beautiful summer's day, and my uncle said to me, that's County Cork over there, and Kerry is there. And he said, Listowel now is over there, he said, where your father was in the mutiny. And of course, I had never heard of the mutiny. And he told me about it then, what happened. He was in the RIC, and they got a directive from Cork, the guy in Cork and control in Cork, they were to shoot Irishmen. So there was no way they were going to shoot Irishmen. He was one of 14 that threw down their jackets, and they ran and they went out on the run then. And that was all I ever heard. I would have been around 10 or 11, I think, about that when I heard it. And I asked my mother then, and my mother knew as much as I knew about it, because what my mother said to me was, your dad doesn't like to talk about it at all. So when I came back that time from holidays in County Limerick, I mentioned it to him. I said, tell me about the mutiny in Listowel. And he said to me, who told you about that? So I told him Uncle Jack had said it. And he said, well, I don't talk about that at all. So I said, please, just tell me something about it. So he went and about the directive they got and what they did, and the mutiny, they threw down the jackets, and that he went on the run then into Scotland. After a while, he worked he joined up with the Free State Army, and he was 5 or 6 years or something like that at the time, can't remember. And then he joined An Garda Síochána, and he was very happy in An Garda Síochána, and served, I think it was about, he did more than the 30 years. He did about 35, I think, years in the Garda Síochána. And yeah, he was promoted to sergeant. He loved it, and he was at a local station. So he was really a lovely man, sadly missed when he passed away.
My connection to the Listowel mutineers is through Constable Jeremiah Mee, who was my grandfather.
How well did you know your grandfather?
Well, unfortunately, both my grandfather and my grandmother died before any of their grandchildren were born. But we did learn a great deal about both of them from my father, my uncle, and my aunts, including his last surviving child, my Aunt Teresa. and of course we also picked up a lot from personal photographs, personal letters, and other family memorabilia that we have.
What kind of man was your grandfather?
At heart, Grandpa was a devoted family man. He was quite serious-minded too, with a very strong sense of personal values, of right and wrong, fairness and unfairness, and that stayed with him all of his life. Grandpa was a disciplinarian as well, but underneath that, he could be extremely compassionate and loving even, especially towards family and friends. And while discipline was important to Grandpa, his approach to it was in some ways quite unconventional when you think about the era in which he lived. For example, he and Granny as parents were adamant that corporal punishment wouldn't happen in their household, and they stuck by that. Grandpa believed in discipline, there's no doubt about that, but he strangely didn't see corporal punishment as discipline. He saw it as indiscipline on the part of adults. So he was a man of very firm, fixed views on certain issues and subjects. Well, that goes back to when the Bureau of Military History was set up, and Grandpa was asked as part of that to provide a witness statement. So he first began writing out of a sense of personal obligation. Later on, a writer friend of his from Sligo, Philip Rooney, encouraged Grandpa to produce a personal memoir. And Philip, he somehow seems to have also persuaded Grandpa to publish a set of articles for newspapers, which were later serialised in the Leitrim Leader and Reynolds News in the early 1950s. Well, as far as the writing as a process went, it's important to remember that Grandpa Jerry was by and large a self-taught man. He also first started writing at his home in Lochagar in County Westmeath, in a house with no electricity and no running water. But Grandpa was a constant self-improver in everything he did, whether as a husband, a father, in his job, personal fitness, or whatever. So he researched his facts as carefully as he could, and he would constantly ask for feedback from Philip and also from his children, right down to individual sentences. And then he would do draft after redraft on his old typewriter. I ought to say as well that as far as the memoirs go, that the family doesn't think Grandpa ever intended to publish the memoirs himself, because he bequeathed them in his will along with the residue of his estate to his fourth child, my late Aunt Peggy. So I think it was in Grandpa's mind for Peggy to decide what to do with them, whether just to keep them within the family, hand them over to the public in some way, or whatever. Grandpa was very private generally.
How do you think your grandfather would feel about the town of Listowel commemorating the mutiny that took place there in 1920?
Oh, Grandpa would have been delighted and grateful for his friends and comrades who took part in the mutiny. Grandpa always had a very deep affection and admiration for those men. For himself, he would have been highly embarrassed, to say the least, but at the same time, he would have probably seen it as his duty to support Listowel in any way he could in marking the occasion. He did feel a great bond with the people of Listowel. in the same way as he did with his native Glenamaddy in Galway, which was a very special place for him personally.
The impact of the Listowel Mutiny cannot be underestimated, therefore. British politicians scrambled to refute the charges that Smith had called for a shoot-to-kill policy, which may not actually be what he called for, rather it was a shoot if an order to stop was ignored policy. But their efforts were in vain, and the public in Ireland and elsewhere believed what me and the other mutineers had reported. The mutiny received coverage in national and international press. Hundreds of RIC men resigned or were dismissed in the aftermath, and without their extensive training, their sometimes moderating influences and local knowledge, the reprisals from the Black and Tans and auxiliaries grew more violent and more frequent. Unlike long-time RIC men, the Black and Tans received little training and were mainly confined to barracks and were distrusted and ultimately hated by the local populace. The Listowel Mutiny was not an outlier. Indeed, it was symptomatic of what was happening within the RIC in this time. The viciousness of the Black and Tans made international headlines and led on by, in some cases, the example of the Listowel Mutiny. Many long-service RIC men felt no option but to leave the job, their barracks and their area, for their own safety and that of their families. Thanks then to their ill-prepared policing, brutal reprisals and vicious outrages on the civilian population, the Black and Tans soon alienated the communities as a surge in support for the Republican cause swelled. The Listowel Mutiny played an important part in the development of this history of the War of Independence, and the RIC men who instigated it are rightfully remembered and commemorated.